The first rays of dawn broke over the forest, spilling gold and silver light across the dew-laden grass. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and earth, and somewhere far off, a wolf howled, a signal that the pack stirred and the day had begun. Within the stronghold of the Silverfang pack, stone walls rose like silent sentinels, guarding the Alpha's dominion. It was a place of order, strength, and unwavering loyalty, where every member understood the hierarchy, yet beneath that rigid structure, currents of desire and emotion often flowed unseen. At the heart of the stronghold sat Alpha Kalen, his frame commanding even in repose. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that mirrored the forest itself, green, piercing, and eternal. He radiated power without a single word spoken. His presence was a statement, a warning, and a promise all at once. He was not cruel, but he demanded respect, loyalty, and perfection. Every wolf in his pack knew that to serve him was to serve the pack, and to fail him was to court danger. Yet, beneath his stoic exterior, there lingered an unspoken loneliness, one that gnawed at the edges of his immense strength. For Kalen, the throne of the pack was never truly heavy. What weighed upon him was the void of companionship, the quiet echo of nights spent alone. This morning, however, something had shifted. The Alpha had sensed it before he even opened his eyes, the presence of someone new in the stronghold. Not just any wolf, but a guard whose aura spoke of restraint and potential, one who moved with purpose, and yet carried a spark of curiosity too bright to ignore. The new guard had arrived at first light, silently stepping into the courtyard where Kalen often observed his pack at work. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, yet there was a subtle tension in the way he carried himself, a balance between readiness and uncertainty. He was young, though not inexperienced, with eyes that seemed to drink in every detail of the stronghold, measuring, judging, learning. His coat was a dark, almost charcoal gray, sleek and unblemished, and even from a distance, Kalen could sense the fire within him. It was rare to find a wolf who carried both strength and awareness in such delicate harmony. Kalen's gaze followed him as he passed the line of guards, nodding respectfully, acknowledging their presence without breaking stride. Every step was measured, purposeful, yet there was a fluid grace that made his movements almost mesmerizing. Even without meaning to, Kalen felt a pull, a magnetic curiosity that he had not experienced in years. Something about this wolf stirred him, a whisper beneath the surface of his alpha dominance that both intrigued and unnerved him. Kalen, called one of H's lieutenants, breaking the morning's silence. The new guard reports for duty. He awaits your command. Kalen rose from his seat, the sound of his movement sharp against the quiet, like a predator's warning. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath as he approached the newcomer. Every wolf in the pack instinctively stepped back, giving the alpha and the new guard a wide berth. He stopped a mere arm's length away, and for a long moment he simply studied him. No words were spoken, none were needed. In the silence, Kalen's eyes traced the guard's form, from the strong line of his jaw to the subtle tension in his hands, noting every detail, every imperfection and strength alike. "You are the new guard?" Kalen's voice broke the quiet, deep and resonant, carrying authority without cruelty. "Yes, Alpha Kalen," the guard replied, his tone steady, unwavering, though his pulse betrayed the slightest tremor beneath his calm. "I am loyal to you and the pack. I will serve to the best of my ability." Kalen studied him a moment longer, then allowed a faint nod. "I expect more than loyalty," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I expect competence, precision, awareness. Mistakes are costly here, and hesitation can be fatal. You understand?" The guard did not flinch. "I understand, Alpha. I will not fail." Kalen's gaze lingered on him, sharp, evaluating, as though testing the boundaries of his promise. He could sense the fire in the guard, the quiet confidence masked by discipline, but he also sensed restraint, a deliberate holding back, as if the wolf had yet to reveal his true strength. That alone intrigued the alpha. Most wolves, when first stepping into the Silverfang stronghold, were either overconfident or meek. Few carried the balance of humility and potential. Fewer still stirred interest in Kalen's otherwise guarded heart. "Very well," Kalen said finally. "You will shadow me for the day. Watch, learn, protect. Your instincts will be tested sooner than you expect. Fail, and the consequences will be yours. Succeed, and you may yet earn my attention." The guard inclined his head respectfully, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something Kalen could not name. Defiance? Curiosity? Perhaps both. And it was intoxicating. The day began with patrols. Kalen moved through the forest with an almost unnatural ease, every movement calculated, every sense alert. He noticed everything: the rustle of leaves, the subtle changes in the wind, the faint scent of prey and danger alike. The guard followed silently, matching his pace, yet always just a step behind, allowing Kalen to lead while demonstrating awareness. Kalen found himself observing him not only for skill but for subtle reactions, the way he scanned the trees, how his ears twitched at the SLIGH test sound, the way his hand instinctively rested near his weapon. By midday, they had encountered a minor threat, a lone rogue wolf, reckless and hungry, unaware of the Alpha's vigilance. Kalen moved first, muscles coiling, eyes narrowing, but before he could strike, the guard acted. In a swift, fluid motion, he intercepted the rogue, forcing him back without harming him excessively, controlling the situation with a precision that spoke of rigorous training and instinctive intelligence. Kalen watched, a flicker of surprise, and something closer to admiration, crossing his features. "You have skill," he said once the rogue had fled. "More than I anticipated." The guard inclined his head again, but there was no arrogance in his gesture. "I only did what was necessary, Alpha." Kalen found himself studying him again, more closely now. The guard's restraint, his discipline, his courage, all of it demanded respect. And yet, there was something more, an unspoken challenge, a spark that Kalen could not ignore. It was dangerous to feel such intrigue. Dangerous to feel curiosity that bordered on something else entirely. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in hues of fire and gold, Kalen and the guard returned to the stronghold. The Alpha's mind was restless, replaying moments from the day, the guard's movements, the calm strength in his voice, the way he had handled danger without hesitation. Kalen was a master of control, of dominance, yet this wolf unsettled him in a way he could not fully articulate. He felt a pull toward him, a desire to know more, to test the boundaries of what he allowed himself to feel. Later, in the quiet of his private chamber, Kalen sat alone, the fire crackling before him. He traced his fingers along the edge of the desk, but his mind was elsewhere, on the guard who had entered his life like a storm, quietly yet undeniably. The Alpha did not usually contemplate companionship. Such things were distractions, vulnerabilities. Yet, a tiny, almost imperceptible thought whispered in his mind, perhaps this one is different. Outside, the forest murmured with life, the pack settling into the rhythm of night. Somewhere in the distance, the wolf howled again, a lonely sound that resonated deep within Kalen. And as he sat in silence, watching the shadows flicker and dance, he felt the faint stirrings of something dangerous, something exhilarating, something he could not ignore. For the first time in years, the Alpha of the Silverfang pack found himself wondering not about control or duty, but about the quiet, steady presence of the guard who had captured not just his attention, but the whisper of his heart. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The forest was alive with whispers of movement, the soft rustling of leaves and the gentle crack of twigs underfoot marking the rhythm of life within the Silverfang territory. Morning had barely brushed the horizon when Kalen awoke, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the high windows of his chamber. Even in repose, he carried the weight of his position, the mantle of Alpha pressing against his broad shoulders like an invisible armor. He had spent years mastering control, suppressing distractions, maintaining the image of strength that his pack relied upon. Yet, since the arrival of the new guard, there had been a subtle shift in the air, a quiet ripple that he could not dismiss, no matter how tightly he clutched at his discipline. The guard, whose name Kalen had yet to formally learn, moved with the silence of shadows, already patrolling the perimeter before the Alpha had risen from his bed. There was a precision to his movements, a purpose that suggested not only training but instinct. Each step was deliberate, yet fluid, his senses finely tuned to the nuances of the forest that Kalen himself could have overlooked. The Alpha's eyes followed him from his chamber window, noting the small movements, the flick of an ear, the subtle tension in his shoulders, as if he could read the very rhythm of his thoughts in the way he moved. Kalen felt the pull again, subtle but undeniable, the curiosity that clawed at his composure. It was a dangerous sensation, one that the Alpha had long dismissed as weakness, yet he could not deny it now. Not with this wolf. The peace of the morning, however, was fragile. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as though it too sensed the shifting currents of tension. And soon, Kalen understood why. A faint scent on the wind, a metallic tang that spoke of blood and fear, drifted toward the stronghold. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, the alpha instincts he had honed over decades immediately alerting him to the danger. His gaze sharpened, sweeping the perimeter, analyzing every shadow, every movement. The guard was already aware, his posture shifting as he caught the same faint warning in the air. There was no hesitation, no need for orders. Both were in perfect synchrony, their senses aligned in silent acknowledgement of the threat. Kalen stepped into the courtyard, boots striking stone with authority, and the pack members immediately took their positions. The new guard moved alongside him, blending into the formation with seamless efficiency. It was in these moments, when danger approached, that Kalen felt the unspoken measure of a wolf's worth. Many had joined his ranks, loyal and eager, yet few possessed the instinctual understanding that made one indispensable. This guard, this enigmatic, disciplined presence, was different. Every movement was calculated, protective, yet unassuming. A balance of strength and restraint that mirrored Kalen's own, though without the weight of command. The wind shifted again, carrying a louder, sharper note of threat. From the edge of the trees, a group of rogue wolves emerged, their eyes glinting with hostility, their movements predatory. They had come in search of dominance, a challenge to Kalen's rule, yet they were unaware of the Alpha's watchful presence, or the guard who now stood beside him. The pack tensed, muscles coiled, ready to defend territory and leader alike. Kalen's gaze swept over the rogues, assessing, calculating, a storm of strategy forming in his mind even as his pulse quickened with anticipation. The first wolf lunged, teeth bared, a snarl tearing through the crisp morning air. Kalen met him with a swift strike, powerful, precise, a demonstration of raw alpha strength that sent the attacker staggering backward. The new guard moved immediately, intercepting another rogue with an efficiency that left Kalen momentarily impressed, his stoicism slipping just enough to allow a flash of admiration. The guard's movements were fluid, yet controlled, each action purposeful, each decision instinctual. He did not simply follow orders, he anticipated, adapted, protected. And in doing so, he drew Kalen's attention in a way that few had ever managed. Time seemed to stretch in the chaos, each heartbeat elongated as danger and instinct merged. Kalen moved with the lethal grace of an alpha, yet always aware of the guard at his side. There was an unspoken communication between them, a rhythm that required no words, no commands, only instinct and trust. The alpha found himself observing more than commanding, taking note of the subtle cues in the guard's expression, the way his jaw tightened, the focus in his eyes, the brief exhale as he redirected an attacker. There was courage there, yes, but also something deeper, a quiet determination that radiated not just competence, but integrity. The fight was over almost as quickly as it began. The rogues retreated, their pride wounded, their numbers diminished by the relentless precision of the Silverfang defense. Kalen stood amidst his pack, chest heaving, sweat glistening on his skin, yet his attention remained fixed on the guard. The wolf had sustained no visible injuries, yet Kalen knew better. He could sense the strain in his movements, the subtle tension that betrayed exhaustion beneath the composed exterior. And still, the guard had held fast, unwavering, loyal not merely to the pack, but to the Alpha himself. Impressive, Kalen murmured, stepping closer, his voice low, carrying an authority that did not demand but observed. The guard met his gaze, steady, unwavering, though Kalen thought he detected a flicker of surprise, or perhaps pride. "You did not falter." The guard inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "I did what was necessary, Alpha. The pack is safe." Kalen studied him for a long moment, the fire of the morning reflected in his green eyes. "It is rare," he said finally, "to find a wolf who acts without hesitation, without seeking glory, yet executes with precision. You possess that rare quality." His words were deliberate, measured, but beneath them lay an acknowledgement that went beyond mere commendation. Kalen's thoughts wandered, perilously close to territories he had long avoided, the territory of personal attachment, of desire, of curiosity. He found himself imagining scenarios, hypothetical challenges, where this guard's presence mattered not just to the pack's safety, but to his own heart. It was dangerous. It was unnecessary. And yet, he could not look away. The forest settled into an uneasy calm as the pack reorganized, each member returning to their duties under Kalen's watchful gaze. But the Alpha did not move immediately. He remained near the guard, observing, analyzing, measuring. He found himself noting small details, the way sunlight glinted off the guard's dark coat, the subtle flexing of his fingers as he adjusted his stance, the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing despite the recent exertion. These were small, insignificant details to any ordinary observer, but Kalen's eyes were not ordinary. They missed nothing, and in those small observations, an unfamiliar warmth began to creep into his chest, a quiet acknowledgement of admiration, perhaps even something closer to fascination. As the sun reached its zenith, Kalen finally spoke again, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the forest. "Walk with me," he commanded, and the guard fell into step at his side without hesitation. They moved through the forest in silence, each footfall deliberate, the wind whispering through the trees as if carrying secrets only they could hear. Kalen allowed himself a rare indulgence, to observe the guard without expectation, without duty, simply to take in the presence of this wolf who had stirred something unfamiliar within him. The day passed in a blur of observation, patrols, and quiet reflection. Kalen found his mind wandering repeatedly back to the morning's events, to the unspoken connection that had formed amidst the chaos of battle. The guard had proven himself capable, yes, but there was more, a subtle alignment of instincts, a resonance of purpose that Kalen had not anticipated. He was a predator, a leader, an alpha who commanded fear and respect in equal measure, yet in this wolf, he sensed a partnership, a potential equal not in rank but in spirit. As dusk approached, painting the forest in hues of amber and rose, Kalen led the guard back to the stronghold. The pack settled around them, returning to routines, yet the Alpha remained silent, contemplative. He walked beside the guard, the distance between them measured not in proximity but in the unspoken tension that lingered, palpable and electric. Kalen realized, with both caution and an undeniable thrill, that the day's events had changed something, within the pack, within the forest, and within himself. Later, in the solitude of his chamber, Kalen stood before the mirror, examining the reflection of a man who was unaccustomed to distraction, unaccustomed to intrigue, unaccustomed to curiosity of this kind. The guard had challenged him, not with words or defiance, but with presence, with skill, with a quiet, unwavering confidence that demanded notice. Kalen's heart, long trained to measure power and strategy, found itself recklessly skipping beats, a sensation he had not felt in many cycles of the moon. Somewhere deep within, a whisper emerged, tentative, almost imperceptible. "This wolf is more than he appears." And Kalen, alpha of the Silverfang pack, felt the stirrings of something he had spent a lifetime suppressing. fascination, admiration, and perhaps the first, dangerous threads of desire. The night settled over the stronghold, stars emerging like silver sparks across the velvet sky. The alpha of the Silverfang pack remained awake long after the pack had slept, thoughts of the guard weaving through his mind, quiet, insistent, inescapable. And for the first time in many years, Kalen allowed himself to consider that the threads of fate had brought more than a guard into his life. They had brought the first glimmer of something wholly unexpected, and entirely his own. The forest breathed in the quiet of twilight, shadows stretching and blending with the amber glow of the fading sun. Even the wind seemed to move more deliberately, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures awakening from their hidden dens. The Silverfang pack stronghold had quieted after the day's chaos. The threat of the rogue wolves had passed, yet the energy of battle lingered in the air, a residue of adrenaline and tension that neither Kalen nor the guard could shake entirely. Kalen walked through the courtyard alone at first, boots silent against the stone path, eyes scanning the horizon as though danger might still be waiting, hiding in the folds of shadow. The Alpha's senses were always alert, a habit ingrained over decades, yet there was a subtle difference tonight, a distraction that tugged at the edges of his focus, a weight in his chest that was neither burden nor fatigue, but curiosity, fascination, and something more difficult to define. The guard emerged from the shadows without a sound, as though he were art of the forest itself. Kalen felt the familiar pull at the sight of him, the taut muscles beneath his dark coat, the deliberate grace in every movement, the calm awareness that radiated like an aura around him. Unlike the chaos of battle, this moment was still, intimate in its own way. The guard's eyes, alert yet unreadable, followed Kalen with measured attentiveness, the slightest hint of deference tempered by confidence. It was a delicate balance, one that drew Kalen's gaze, his mind, and, he realized with a start, his heart. They moved side by side in silence, the air thick with unspoken acknowledgement. The Alpha's thoughts wandered, unbidden, to the events of the day, the rogue wolves, the guard's precise actions, the way he had anticipated every move, protected every flank, yet remained composed, almost serene amidst chaos. Most wolves would have faltered, allowed fear or inexperience to cloud their instincts. But this guard, this enigma of shadow and strength, had stood unwavering, a pillar of stability in the storm. Kalen recognized instinct when he saw it, and he could not deny the pull that stirred within him, the quiet admiration that edged toward something far more personal, more dangerous. They reached the edge of the forest where the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting silver streaks over the mossy ground. Kalen stopped, inhaling the night air, the scent of pine and earth grounding him even as his mind raced. The guard paused as well, close enough that their shoulders brushed slightly, a friction that sent a subtle shiver through Kalen, one he would not allow to betray his thoughts. Yet, despite the restraint, he could not ignore the sensation of closeness, the quiet electricity that hummed between them in the cool night. Kalen's eyes swept over the guard once more, taking in the fine details, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell just slightly across his brow, the subtle tension in his posture that spoke of discipline and readiness. There was something profoundly captivating in the way the guard balanced strength with restraint, courage with thoughtfulness. He had seen many warriors, many wolves who claimed bravery and failed to live up to it, but this one, this singular, quiet force, was different. Kalen's mind traced a dangerous path, one that wandered from strategy and duty into curiosity, fascination, and something that threatened to shatter the boundaries he had long maintained. The forest around them seemed to contract, the night quiet but for the gentle whisper of the breeze. Kalen became acutely aware of every detail. The faint rise and fall of the guard's chest as he breathed, the small tension in his fists, the way his scent, earthy, strong, disciplined, mingled subtly with the fresh night air. The Alpha could feel the faint stirrings of emotion that he had long denied himself. Admiration, yes, but something more primal, more instinctive, a pull toward the presence of this wolf that was difficult to define, and yet undeniable. They walked further into the shadows of the trees, the moonlight weaving through branches to illuminate patches of moss and fallen leaves. Kalen's senses remained alert, trained to detect danger, yet his mind wandered, tracing patterns of movement, of potential, of possibility. He considered the guard, not just as a warrior, a protector, or a member of the pack, but as an individual, singular, complex, and unknowable. He wondered what it would mean to truly know him, to pierce the calm exterior and glimpse the thoughts beneath, the moments of vulnerability that all wolves carried, hidden from view. The guard remained silent, as he had all day, yet there was a subtle rhythm in his steps, a cadence that Kalen noted and felt drawn to. Every motion, deliberate and controlled, spoke of restraint, discipline, and yet a quiet confidence that radiated without words. It was mesmerizing, the kind of presence that pulled at the edges of consciousness, demanding attention even when the mind sought to resist. Kalen felt himself drawn to that presence, unable to fully articulate the stirrings within, yet unwilling to turn away. Night deepened, and the forest became a tapestry of shadow and silver light. Kalen paused beside a small clearing, the scent of wildflowers and damp earth mingling in the air. He turned to the guard, taking in the contours of his face, the steady gaze that met his own with quiet intensity. For the first time, Kalen allowed himself to notice the finer details, the faint scar above the guard's brow, evidence of battles past, the calluses along his hands, testament to years of training and discipline, the subtle warmth in his presence that seemed to seep into the night, threading through the Alpha's awareness like a silent current. It was a private moment, rare and fleeting, and Kalen realized with a pang that he had never before felt this way, this combination of admiration, curiosity, and something dangerously intimate. He had always maintained control, always kept his heart shielded behind duty, dominance, and discipline. Yet here, in the quiet embrace of the forest night, with the guard so close, he felt the fragile stirrings of vulnerability, of longing, of a connection he could not yet name. The guard shifted slightly, as if sensing Kalen's attention, yet made no move to withdraw or break the delicate tension. Kalen felt the subtle brush of proximity, the almost imperceptible warmth of presence, and a thought, unbidden and reckless, flared in his mind. What would it mean to let this closeness exist without restraint? The question was dangerous, even foolish, yet he could not deny the allure, the pull toward the possibility of something beyond duty, beyond the rigid structure of the pack, beyond the carefully maintained walls of his own heart. For a long moment they remained in the clearing, two figures framed by silver moonlight and shadowed trees. Kalen's mind traced possibilities, scenarios, risks, and consequences, yet beneath every calculation lingered a quiet, undeniable fascination. The guard was more than a protector, he was a presence that demanded attention, a force that unsettled the Alpha's carefully maintained equilibrium without even trying. Kalen felt the stirrings of desire, curiosity, and connection intertwine, creating a sensation that was as exhilarating as it was perilous. The night deepened further, and yet neither moved. The forest seemed to recognize the weight of the moment, the delicate tension between two beings who had met in battle, who now stood on the precipice of understanding, recognition, and the subtle beginnings of something profoundly intimate. Kalen felt the pulse of his own anticipation, the rhythm of his heartbeat echoing in the quiet air. He sensed the guard's awareness of him, the subtle alertness beneath composure, and yet there was no fear, no hesitation, only presence, readiness, and an unspoken acknowledgement of shared space, shared moment, shared potential. The Alpha finally allowed himself a long, slow exhale, releasing a fraction of the control he maintained at all times. It was a private indulgence, a fleeting recognition that the guard was not merely a wolf in his service, but something more, someone whose presence unsettled, intrigued, and awakened something long dormant within him. Kalen's thoughts lingered on the day's events, the battle, the loyalty, the strength, and the quiet, undeniable pull that had grown with every step, every glance, every subtle gesture of competence and courage. For hours they remained there, the night wrapping around them like a cloak, the forest silent but for the distant call of a nocturnal bird and the whisper of wind through the trees. Kalen did not speak, the guard did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Presence, observation, acknowledgement, that was enough. In the quiet, the Alpha realized that the stirrings within him were not fleeting, not momentary distractions. They were the first threads of something dangerous, exhilarating, and wholly new. Desire, curiosity, fascination, respect, they had all coalesced in the figure of the guard who had captured not just his attention, but the first fragile stirrings of his guarded heart. As dawn began to creep on the horizon, painting the edges of the forest in gold and silver light once again, Kalen finally turned back. Toward the stronghold, the guard following without hesitation, their steps in measured rhythm. The private moment had passed, yet its echoes lingered in the Alpha's mind and chest. He knew, with both caution and anticipation, that the day's events had shifted something fundamental. The guard was no longer merely a protector, he was a presence that would demand reckoning, understanding, and perhaps, eventually, a recognition that Kalen had never allowed himself before, a recognition of connection, of intimacy, of something dangerously close to love. And for the first time in years, Kalen welcomed the thought, even as he acknowledged its risk, its peril, and its inevitability. The morning broke with a hesitant light, spilling pale gold across the forest canopy, yet within Kalen's chamber, the Alpha's mind was far from the calm serenity that dawn suggested. He sat rigidly on the edge of his bed, fingers pressed to his forehead as if he could physically restrain the storm of thoughts that threatened to unravel his carefully maintained composure. The previous night's quiet encounter with the guard replayed incessantly, a vivid loop of movements, glances, and silent understanding. It was not merely admiration that gnawed at him now, it was a deeper, more forbidden stir, one that tugged at the edges of the control he had spent years perfecting. Kalen's eyes traced the shadows cast by the rising sun, dancing across the walls like fleeting reminders of the pull he could not resist. The forest outside the stronghold awakened slowly, birds calling in cautious notes, leaves rustling under the tentative movement of small creatures. Every sound, every scent, seemed amplified by the intensity of his focus, his senses tuned not to the external world but to the presence of the guard who had unsettled him with quiet strength, calm competence, and an aura of subtle danger. He had observed countless wolves, measured loyalty, tested strength, and demanded obedience. Yet none had stirred him as this one did, none had managed to tread so intimately upon the delicate threads of his disciplined heart. He thought of the guard, of the deliberate movements, the calm gaze, the perfect balance of restraint and instinct. The memory of their proximity, of the brush of shoulders in the clearing, of the shared silence beneath the silver light of the moon, haunted him. The Alpha of the Silverfang pack had faced enemies, challengers, and betrayal, yet he found himself powerless against a presence so simple, so human, yet so profoundly stirring. He could feel it in his chest, a heat that had no purpose beyond distraction, a pulse that thrummed in opposition to the calm, calculated rhythm he had cultivated for decades. It was a dangerous thought, one Kalen could not allow to bloom furt. There was a hierarchy, a duty, a strict order to the world he commanded. Personal desires were liabilities, distractions that could unravel not only his own strength but the security of the entire pack. Yet, despite this knowledge, his mind lingered on the guard, returning again and again to the same images, the same emotions, the same silent pull that gnawed insistently at reason. Kalen rose from the bed, boots echoing softly against the stone floor, and moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. The guard was already at his post, early as ever, scanning the perimeter with careful precision. Kalen's eyes lingered, noting the subtle flex of muscles, the gentle shift of weight, the small signs of readiness that marked competence but also, unintentionally, elegance. He knew it was folly to let his mind dwell on such things, yet he could not help himself. The sight alone stirred a wave of forbidden fascination, a dangerous admixture of admiration and something more primal, something that pressed against the boundaries of propriety and hierarchy. The alpha's thoughts drifted, unbidden, toward the implications of these feelings. What would it mean to allow himself a connection with this wolf? The very notion was fraught with peril. To admit even to himself that he was drawn to the guard was to risk exposure, to risk perception, to risk vulnerability. Yet, as he observed the guard with careful attention, Kalen realized that the pull he felt was not fleeting. It was persistent, insistent, growing with each passing moment, an undercurrent beneath duty that demanded recognition. He remembered the moments in the clearing, the quiet acceptance of proximity, the almost imperceptible acknowledgement of presence, the way the guard's eyes had met his without fear, without hesitation. There had been trust in that gaze, unspoken but tangible, a confidence that did not bow to his alpha dominance but instead met it as an equal. And in that equality, Kalen felt the stirrings of desire, curiosity, and a longing that he could not name but could not deny. It was a temptation he had never known, a danger he had never faced, and yet it called to him with a force he could not resist. The morning continued, the stronghold slowly awakening to the rhythm of daily life. Wolves moved about their duties with quiet efficiency, yet Kalen's focus remained internal, a tempest of emotion and thought that refused to settle. Every movement of the guard was magnified in his awareness, every glance, every shift, every small gesture becoming a spark that ignited the coals of fascination deep within him. He recognized the folly in such attentiveness. It was unprofessional, irrational, and potentially disastrous. Yet he could not tear his thoughts away. As the day wore on, Kalen A.T. tempted to redirect his focus toward matters of duty, patrols, pack strategy, and territory management, but the distraction remained, insistent and unrelenting. Even in conversation with lieutenants and pack elders, his mind wandered, replaying moments, dissecting expressions, analyzing every subtle nuance of the guard's behavior. He became acutely aware of the guard's proximity, of the disciplined posture, the silent strength, the latent energy that radiated from him in a way that both fascinated and unsettled Kalen. He found himself questioning the source of this pull, attempting to categorize it, rationalize it, contain it. Was it admiration, respect, fascination, or something more intimate, something that dared to tread into the territory of desire, of emotional connection, of forbidden longing? Each possibility was dangerous, yet each seemed to resonate with a truth he could not deny. The Alpha realized, with an almost painful clarity, that he had never encountered a presence so profoundly compelling, so wholly unyielding to his attempts at control. The guard was a force in himself, balanced, disciplined, and yet magnetic, a combination that challenged every assumption Kalen had about loyalty, desire, and personal boundaries. During a brief moment of solitude, Kalen returned to the courtyard, pacing under the canopy of trees, the sunlight glinting off leaves and stone alike. The guard remained in the distance, vigilant yet unaware of the intensity with which the Alpha observed him. Kalen's heart thumped against the walls of his chest, a rhythmic reminder of the stirrings within, of the fascination that had become a tide he could no longer resist. He wanted to close the distance, to test the boundaries, to allow proximity to translate into connection, but he also knew the peril. To act on these feelings, even subtly, could compromise authority, unsettle the pack, and expose the vulnerabilities he had spent a lifetime hiding. And yet, the thought of restraint was equally unbearable. Each glance, each subtle movement of the guard, seemed to whisper possibilities of trust, intimacy, and understanding. Kalen felt the tension in his chest, a coiling mix of anticipation and dread, recognition and denial. It was the duality of desire and duty, attraction and propriety, power and vulnerability, a delicate balance he had never before been forced to navigate with such intensity. Hours passed, and the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the stronghold. Kalen remained vigilant in appearance, yet internally, he wrestled with the forbidden stirrings that had taken root in his heart. He could not dismiss them, could not push them aside as he had done with fleeting attractions in the past. This was not superficial. This was not transient. The pull of the guard's presence, his quiet strength, his unwavering competence, and the subtle humanity beneath his disciplined exterior had woven themselves into Kalen's consciousness in a way that defied control, defied reason, and defied the rules of hierarchy he had so carefully maintained. As twilight descended, the Alpha retired to the upper terraces, overlooking the expanse of the forest beyond the stronghold. The moon rose in silver arcs, casting a soft glow across the treetops. Kalen's thoughts returned, once more, to the guard, the measured steps, the quiet vigilance, the presence that both calmed and provoked him. It was a dangerous allure, a force that threatened to disrupt the careful equilibrium he maintained, yet it was irresistible. The Alpha understood, with reluctant clarity, that the guard had become more than a companion in duty. He had become an anchor for curiosity, a spark for desire, and a mirror to Kalen's own vulnerability. And within that recognition lay the beginning of a transformation, subtle and inexorable. The Alpha realized that the feelings he struggled to contain were no longer mere thoughts. They were threads of connection, tendrils of fascination, and undercurrents of longing that demanded acknowledgement. The danger of surrendering to them was real, yet the danger of denial was equally potent. The guard had awakened something within Kalen, a recognition of need, of trust, of intimacy, that he had long denied himself, and which now demanded reckoning. Kalen's gaze swept over the moonlit forest once more, the silver light catching the edges of the trees, the shadows of the stronghold, and, in the distance, the guard, ever vigilant, ever present, ever unknowable. The Alpha's heart tightened with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying, a sensation that whispered of possibilities, perils, and desires he could neither ignore nor fully name. And in that quiet, fragile night, Kalen understood the truth he had long resisted. The guard was no longer just a protector, a wolf of the pack, or a companion in duty. He had become a presence that claimed space within Kalen's mind and heart, a force that demanded recognition, understanding, and perhaps, in time, acceptance. The feelings were forbidden, perilous, and undeniable, and Kalen, Alpha of the Silverfang pack, found himself standing on the precipice of an unknown path, where desire and duty, admiration and longing, power and vulnerability intertwined in a dangerous, exquisite dance that could not be avoided. The forest at dawn was muted, cloaked in mist that wove itself between the trunks of ancient trees like delicate silk. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth, pine, and distant rain. Even the familiar sounds of the Silverfang pack, foots, taps of early risers, the faint stirring of wings, seemed softened by the lingering fog, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Within the stronghold, Kalen moved with his usual precision, boots silent against stone floors, shoulders squared, back straight, and yet his mind was a tempest of thoughts he could neither quell nor control. The morning had begun like any other, duty first, vigilance second. But Kalen's thoughts betrayed him at every turn, wandering back to the guard, the quiet figure who had become the axis around which his attention now spun. He had spent days observing, analyzing, controlling the pull that the guard elicited, yet the restraint he had relied upon so rigidly was fraying. The memories of their shared silence in the forest clearing, the proximity that had left his chest taut, the way the guard's gaze had met his without fear or submission, they haunted him. Each memory pressed against him like a shadow, insistent and impossible to dismiss. As Kalen patrolled the perimeter, his senses sharp for danger, his eyes inevitably fell upon the guard. He stood at attention near the edge of the courtyard, every muscle coiled in readiness, every movement precise. Kalen's gaze lingered, taking in the slight rise of his shoulders, the disciplined poise, the quiet strength that radiated even in stillness. There was a pull in his chest, subtle but insistent, a tension that had nothing to do with vigilance or strategy. He could feel the stirrings of a need he had long denied, an awareness that this wolf, so steadfast, so disciplined, had become more than a companion, more than a protector. Kalen's mind wrestled with the reality of the emotions coursing beneath his control. Duty demanded distance, discipline demanded focus, yet his heart, an organ he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge, rebelled with quiet insistence. The Alpha realized with reluctant clarity that fascination had become something deeper, an acknowledgement of connection, an emotional tether that could not be severed. He was aware of the danger in these feelings, the fragility of control, the vulnerability of desire, but the pull was relentless, insistent, and it demanded recognition. The day unfolded with the precision of routine, yet Kalen's focus was fractured. Each command he issued to the pack, each strategy he assessed, felt partially displaced by the constant awareness of the guard's presence. He noted every subtle movement, the slight flex of the wrist as the guard adjusted his posture, the measured cadence of his steps, the way he scanned the forest beyond the walls with an unspoken vigilance. These details, small and ordinary in isolation, had become the axis of Kalen's attention, drawing him into a vortex of emotion and fascination. By mid-afternoon, Kalen found himself walking alone through the forest beyond the stronghold, ostensibly to inspect the perimeter, but in truth to create space for reflection, to navigate the storm of emotion that had taken root within him. The guard appeared beside him without sound, a shadow stepping seamlessly into the path, always attentive, always composed. Kalen felt the familiar pull in his chest, a tension sharpened by proximity. The guard did not speak, it was unnecessary. The silence between them carried weight, a quiet acknowledgement of shared presence that neither needed to articulate. Kalen's thoughts drifted back to the last battle, to the rogue wolves who had dared to challenge his pack. The memory of the guard's movements, the precision, the calm, the unwavering bravery, was etched into his mind. He recognized instinct when he saw it, and this wolf possessed instinct in its most refined, disciplined form. Yet, it was not only instinct that drew Kalen's attention, it was the subtle grace with which the guard moved, the quiet integrity of his presence, and the unspoken acknowledgement of the Alpha's own strength. The combination of all these factors created a tension within Kalen, one that blurred the lines between admiration, desire, and the dangerous stirrings of personal connection. The walk led them to a secluded clearing, sunlight dappled through the branches above, highlighting the forest floor with patterns of light and shadow. Kalen paused, allowing his gaze to linger on the space around him, but it was the guard, standing a few paces away, who held his focus. The Alpha felt the pull again, subtle yet undeniable, a rhythm of anticipation and tension that threaded through his chest. For the first time, Kalen allowed himself to confront the thought he had resisted for days. He desired more than observation, more than professional respect, more than companionship in duty. He desired connection, recognition, perhaps even intimacy, with the guard. The realization struck him like a physical force. He could feel the blood rushing to his cheeks, the pulse in his throat, the tightness in his chest. Desire, curiosity, admiration, all collided in a storm of emotion he could neither name nor restrain. He had faced enemies, challengers, and betrayals, yet nothing had unsettled him as profoundly as this quiet, disciplined wolf at his side. The weight of duty and the intensity of his alpha position pressed down, yet beneath it all, a dangerous thrill stirred, a recognition of forbidden possibility, of uncharted territory within his own heart. Kalen's breath hitched slightly, unnoticed by the guard, who remained vigilant and composed, a study in discipline. The Alpha's thoughts spiraled, tracing paths of what if and could be scenarios that were dangerous in both imagination and potential reality. What would it mean to acknowledge these feelings? What would it mean to allow proximity, trust, and unspoken fascination to manifest into something more? The very questions threatened control, threatened composure, yet they were irresistible. In the quiet of the clearing, Kalen took a step closer, almost unconsciously, drawn by the pull that had become impossible to ignore. He observed the guard in detail, the slight furrow of concentration in his brow, the subtle curve of his shoulders, the poised tension in his stance. There was nothing careless, nothing unintentional, yet, in every movement, Kalen sensed a vulnerability, a humanity beneath the disciplined exterior that called to him in ways he had not expected. He could feel the edges of restraint slipping, the alpha mask threatening to falter under the weight of unacknowledged emotion. The first words of admission, unspoken, formed in Kalen's mind, fragile and hesitant. He did not intend to speak them aloud, for fear of breaking the fragile balance of trust and authority. Yet the thought of acknowledgement, of recognition, demanded attention. I am drawn to you. I cannot ignore you. I do not wish to. Each phrase was perilous, each internal confession a crack in the wall of composure he had spent a lifetime constructing. The guard remained silent, yet Kalen sensed awareness, as if a wolf had always known that attention had shifted, that fascination had edged into something deeper. The alpha's chest tightened at the thought, the pull of proximity becoming a tangible force, a gravity he could not resist. He found himself imagining scenarios, fleeting, delicate, where trust, recognition, and desire intersected without compromise of duty. The possibilities were dangerous, exhilarating, and utterly consuming. Time seemed to stretch and collapse simultaneously. The forest held its breath as Kalen's thoughts roamed unchecked, the tension of suppressed confession curling through his mind like smoke through trees. The realization that he could not continue to deny the depth of his attention, the intensity of his admiration, and the subtle stirrings of attraction settled over him like a cloak, heavy and impossible to ignore. He recognized that the guard was no longer merely a protector, no longer a figure in duty and hierarchy. He was an anchor of fascination, a catalyst for emotion, and perhaps the first spark of connection Kalen had allowed himself in years. As the sun shifted toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the clearing, Kalen took a deliberate breath, allowing himself a moment of private acknowledgement. He had confessed nothing aloud, but the recognition within himself, the acceptance of desire, curiosity, and admiration, was the first step toward truth. He could not articulate the full weight of emotion yet, could not navigate the dangerous terrain of acknowledgement with the guard present, but the alpha knew that the confession, even unspoken, had changed him. It had unlatched the first door in a series of revelations, the initial breach of control that would inevitably lead to connection, understanding, and perhaps something far deeper than either had anticipated. The guard shifted slightly, as if sensing the unspoken acknowledgement, yet made no move to distance himself. Kalen felt the subtle brush of presence, the quiet tension, and a spark of exhilaration that surged through him. The alpha realized, with clarity tempered by caution, that the bond had begun, not in words, but in presence, observation, and the fragile acknowledgement of emotion. He had confessed to himself, and that alone had altered the landscape of their relationship, setting in motion a course from which there was no turning back. As twilight deepened into night, the forest awash in silver moonlight, Kalen allowed himself one final reflection before returning to the stronghold. The confession to himself had been complete, delicate and private, yet its consequences were undeniable. The guard was no longer merely a companion, no longer simply a protector. He had become an object of fascination, a bearer of subtle vulnerability, and a presence that challenged, unsettled, and stirred the alpha's long-suppressed heart. And in that recognition lay both peril and promise, a delicate balance that Kalen, alpha of the Silverfang pack, could no longer ignore. The forest lay draped in a delicate hush, the kind of quiet that made every breath, every movement, feel magnified. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in long, scattered beams, catching on dew-laden leaves and illuminating the ground with a soft, golden glow. Even the birds seemed to move with careful deliberation, their songs muted as though in reverence of the morning stillness. Within the stronghold, life had begun its usual rhythm, wolves taking to their tasks, routines unfolding with precision, yet Kalen walked through it all with a mind only half attentive. His thoughts returned, as they often did, to the guard. That singular presence had embedded itself into the edges of his consciousness, subtle yet unyielding, like the pull of a tide he could neither resist nor ignore. Kalen had confronted his feelings, had admitted in the privacy of his own mind that admiration and fascination were no longer enough. They had grown into something more complex, something that demanded recognition. He knew the danger of such thoughts. The alpha of the Silverfang pack bore a mantle of responsibility, a duty that had to take precedence over personal desire. Yet, the hum and heart, even in the body of a wolf or an alpha, was a force unto itself, untamed and insistent. The guard was at the perimeter again, alert but calm, every movement precise, each step a study in control. Kalen watched him from a distance, yet the observation was no longer detached or clinical. There was an awareness now, subtle and personal, an undercurrent of tension and admiration that made the alpha's chest tighten. Every breath the guard took, every glance in his direction, seemed amplified, magnified, pulling Kalen into an orbit of fascination that threatened to consume him entirely. He realized, with both awe and apprehension, that he was no longer simply observing a companion, he was acknowledging a presence that had become essential, magnetic, undeniable. The morning unfolded with tasks and inspections, yet Kalen's mind drifted, circling the guard as one might circle a flame, careful, respectful, yet drawn inexorably toward its warmth. He reflected on the last encounter, the quiet clearing where their proximity had left traces in both memory and sensation. That moment had been private, delicate, and yet its effect lingered with unrelenting insistence. It was a subtle thread, invisible yet tangible, connecting them in a way that neither had verbalized but both had felt. And Kalen, alpha of the Silverfang pack, understood with reluctant clarity that the bond had begun, fragile and nascent, but potent in its quiet power. He found himself seeking the guard, not through commands or duty, but through subtle presence, shared space, and observation. There was an instinctive draw, a silent gravity, that pulled Kalen into proximity without overt acknowledgement. Each glance, each gesture, each careful adjustment of stance was a note in a symphony of subtle connection that played across his awareness. The alpha recognized the danger, knew the need for discretion, yet he could not restrain the awareness, the fascination, the quiet thrill that surged each time the guard moved with calm precision nearby. Time stretched and folded in unusual ways as Kalen's focus wove between duty and observation. The forest seemed to respond to the tension, sunlight dappling the ground with patterns of shifting light, leaves whispering in the wind, shadows stretching and contracting in subtle rhythms. It was as if the world itself conspired to heighten awareness, to make every detail stand out, every heartbeat, every step, every glance a marker of connection. Kalen felt the stirrings in his chest, desire tempered by respect, curiosity tempered by restraint, fascination tempered by the weight of his alpha role. By midday, the forest cleared into an open glade near the edge of the Silverfang territory, a space where few wolves ventured and the trees arched high above form a protective canopy. Kalen had chosen it deliberately, seeking solitude but inevitably finding the guard already there, silently observing the perimeter. The alpha's chest tightened at the sight, the quiet perfection of the wolf's presence overwhelming in its subtle power. He felt an almost magnetic pull to approach, yet hesitated, aware of the delicate balance between authority and personal feeling. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, a test of proximity and patience. The guard remained motionless, yet Kalen sensed awareness, the faint tension in the posture betraying nothing overt but speaking volumes in the subtle language of instinct and presence. The alpha felt his pulse quicken, a tension that was both exhilarating and perilous, awareness sharpening to a near painful degree as he contemplated the nearness, the quiet intimacy, and the unspoken acknowledgement hovering between them. The minutes stretched. Kalen studied the guard's features, the strong jaw, the sharp cheekbones, the depth of eyes that seemed to balance vigilance with something more elusive. There was discipline here, yes, but also a quiet humanity, a presence that resonated beyond duty, beyond hierarchy, beyond expectation. Kalen felt the stirrings of emotion deepen, a complex web of fascination, admiration, and desire that had no outlet but observation and reflection. Yet he did not retreat. He could not. There was a need within him, primal yet refined, that demanded presence, proximity, and awareness. The forest responded in kind. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth, pine, and wildflowers in subtle waves. A bird took flight, calling out across the glade, yet even these movements seemed orchestrated by the rhythm of tension that held him and the guard in silent alignment. Kalen noted every detail. The slight turn of the head, the subtle flex of fingers, the shifting weight that indicated readiness and calm. The Alpha's chest tightened as if it might burst, the quiet storm within him demanding acknowledgement, recognition, connection. For the first time, Kalen allowed himself to imagine what it would mean to bridge the unspoken divide, to cross the subtle boundaries of hierarchy and personal restraint, to acknowledge the stirrings of fascination that had become too potent to ignore. He envisioned scenarios of trust, of quiet companionship, of shared space that was more than duty, more than vigilance, more than necessity. It was dangerous, yes, but irresistible. The thought of denial felt heavier than the thought of risk. Hours seemed to pass without measure. The Alpha remained near, the guard equally still, each aware of the other without needing to speak. Every breath, every subtle adjustment of stance, every shifting glance was a note in an intricate symphony of unspoken recognition. Kalen felt his awareness sharpened to the finest edge, every sensation magnified, every heartbeat echoing with the tension and possibility of connection. He realized that the bond forming was no longer nascent, it was deliberate in its subtlety, undeniable in its presence, and irrevocably potent. The guard's eyes occasionally met Kalen's, brief flickers of acknowledgement, calm and controlled, yet charged with something Kalen could not fully articulate. There was trust here, yes, but also something more, an unspoken recognition of shared presence, of shared awareness, of potential intimacy tempered by discipline and circumstance. Kalen's chest ached with the tension, the pull of proximity, and the quiet knowledge that the bond could only deepen if he allowed it. He felt the first threads of vulnerability, delicate yet insistent, weaving into his heart. The Alpha had never allowed such openness, never admitted fascination that was not immediately tempered by duty or control. Yet here, in the soft, filtered light of the forest glade, with the guard poised beside him, he allowed the possibility. He acknowledged, in the deepest recesses of his mind, that the guard's presence was more than necessary, more than duty. It was essential, magnetic, and profoundly stirring. The day waned, shadows lengthening across the forest floor, the soft orange of sunset painting the trees with warmth. Kalen's chest tightened with unspoken tension, with awareness of what was forming, what had already begun. The bond was fragile, delicate, yet it pulsed with energy, with the possibility of recognition, connection, and perhaps a deeper intimacy that neither had yet spoken aloud. As darkness began to fall, the forest alive with the quiet stirrings of nocturnal life, Kalen finally allowed himself to exhale, a slow release of the tension that had threaded through his chest for hours. He did not move away, he did not break the delicate proximity. Instead, he lingered, acknowledging silently the presence that had become central to his awareness, central to the storm of fascination, desire, and admiration that he had long resisted. In that silence, in that shared space, Kalen understood with clear, unyielding certainty, the bond had deepened. It was no longer curiosity or admiration alone, it was recognition, awareness, and the first subtle tendrils of emotional intimacy. The Alpha knew that the path forward was perilous, yet he also knew that the pull, the tension, and the unspoken connection demanded acknowledgement, patience, and deliberate nurturing. And for the first time in many cycles of the sun and moon, Kalen felt a quiet anticipation, a thrill tempered by caution, a recognition that the bond forming between himself and the Gua road was a force he could not resist, a presence that could not be ignored, and a potential for connection that would redefine the boundaries of duty, desire, and loyalty. The night settled over the Silverfang stronghold like a velvet blanket, muffling the sounds of the pack and casting shadows that twisted and stretched along the stone walls. The moon rose slowly, pale and unwavering, spilling silver light across the courtyard and filtering through the trees surrounding the stronghold. There was a serenity in the night, a hush that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something unspoken, and yet beneath it, Kalen felt the familiar tension coil and shift within his chest. It had been days since he had first acknowledged his own fascination with the guard, days in which every glance, every movement, every measured step of the wolf beside him had stirred something deeper than duty or admiration. The bond was growing, subtle and unrelenting, and tonight Kalen was acutely aware that it had reached a point where observation alone could no longer satisfy the pull he felt. He moved through the stronghold silently, boots brushing the stone floors with careful precision, ears attuned to the faintest sounds. The pack had long since retired or retreated to private quarters, leaving the Alpha free to traverse the courtyard and its surrounding paths without interruption. Yet Kalen's purpose was not patrol or oversight. It was the subtle need to be near the guard, to exist in the same space, to acknowledge silently that which had begun to stir between them, a recognition, an unspoken connection that was fragile, potent, and dangerous. The guard was already present at the perimeter, standing like a sentinel beneath the silver glow of the moon. The Alpha's gaze traced every detail, as it had countless times before. The taut line of the jaw, the controlled tension in muscles, the measured rhythm of breath and stance. Yet tonight, the observation was tinged with something more, something primal and intimate that Kalen could neither suppress nor fully understand. It was fascination laced with longing, awareness interwoven with desire, admiration shaded by the first real stirrings of vulnerability. Kalen stepped forward, his movement deliberate, careful, yet instinctively drawn to the presence that had claimed a space within his mind and heart. The guard did not speak, nor did he need to. In the quiet of the night, their proximity alone was enough to set the tension between them into motion. Every subtle shift, the turn of a head, the flex of fingers, the small adjustment of stance, spoke a language that was unspoken yet wholly understood by the Alpha. And Kalen, for the first time in cycles of responsibility and command, allowed himself to consider what it mean to step beyond observation, beyond acknowledgement, beyond the constraints of duty. He drew a measured breath, aware of the pull in his chest, the tightening of muscles, the heat that had begun to build despite the cool night air. The realization settled over him slowly, deliberately. The guard had become more than a presence to be admired from a distance. He was no longer merely a protector or subordinate. He was an anchor for curiosity, a catalyst for emotion, and a mirror to Kalen's own vulnerability, a vulnerability the Alpha had long denied, feared, and buried beneath layers of control. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and the faint trace of the guard's presence. Kalen inhaled deeply, each breath an acknowledgement of proximity, each pulse a quiet reminder of the tension that bound them together in silence. He could feel the gravity between them, subtle yet irresistible, a pull that neither command nor discipline could counter. And in that pull, in that quiet storm of awareness, he found himself standing at the precipice of a moment he had long avoided: vulnerability. Kalen's thoughts wandered to the day's events, the moments when the guard had anticipated danger, the way he had remained composed, the subtle strength and discipline that had protected the pack time and again. But tonight, the Alpha's mind traced a different path, imagining not strategy or vigilance, but presence, closeness, and quiet acknowledgement. He considered what it might mean to allow trust, to allow recognition, to allow himself to step beyond the rigid boundaries of duty and into the delicate terrain of emotional intimacy. The guard shifted slightly, perhaps sensing the weight of Kalen's attention, though he remained outwardly composed. There was a subtle warmth in the presence, a calm that belied the potency of the tension threading between them. Kalen's chest tightened further, an ache of anticipation and fear, of longing and hesitation. The first stirrings of vulnerability were not easy to name. They were unspoken, dangerous, and intoxicating in equal measure, a delicate acknowledgement that both called for courage and risked exposure. The forest around them seemed to contract, the shadows lengthening, the moonlight casting patterns that flickered and danced like whispers of what might be. Kalen felt the pull of proximity, the magnetic draw that had been building since the clearing, since the first recognition of connection and fascination. And tonight, he allowed himself to step closer, to reduce the space between them by mere paces, each movement deliberate, measured, yet guided by the quiet necessity of presence. His gaze softened as it lingered on the guard, noting the subtle signs of awareness beneath the disciplined exterior, the small tightening of the shoulders, the deliberate set of the hands, the faint catch of breath that betrayed the calm control. Kalen felt his own chest ache at the awareness, at the recognition that vulnerability was no longer solely the guard's domain, but had begun to infiltrate his own carefully guarded heart. He had admitted fascination before, but this was more. It was acknowledgement of the stirrings of desire, trust, and the first fragile threads of emotional intimacy. Time seemed suspended, measured not by the rotation of the sun or the shift of shadows, but by the delicate tension that enveloped them. Kalen felt every detail, every nuance, every flicker of awareness magnified. He became acutely aware of the guard's breathing, the subtle shifting of weight, the faint exhalation that echoed his own, a quiet rhythm that bound them in unspoken alignment. The Alpha recognized that vulnerability, though perilous, was not weakness. It was the acknowledgement of connection, of presence, of shared experience that transcended duty and hierarchy. The first thought of confession formed in Kalen's mind, delicate, hesitant, and dangerous: "I trust you." It was not spoken aloud, but the weight of the thought pressed against him, demanding recognition. He considered the meaning of the sentiment, not as a command or obligation, but as an offering of awareness, presence, and openness. It was a step beyond fascination, beyond admiration. It was the first acknowledgement of emotional intimacy, of the bond that had been forming in silence, in shared space, in quiet observation. The guard remained still, poised, yet Kalen sensed the faint tension in the posture, a subtle acknowledgement that the unspoken sentiment had been felt, understood, and recognized. It was a delicate exchange, silent yet profound, a moment that required no words but conveyed everything necessary. The Alpha felt his chest tighten further, a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and awe at the power of such a fragile acknowledgement. Vulnerability, he realized, was a force unto itself, a recognition of trust and presence that demanded courage and acceptance. As night deepened, the forest alive with the subtle stirrings of nocturnal creatures, Kalen allowed himself to linger in the proximity, to exist in the shared space without intrusion, without expectation, without command. The guard's presence was steady, a quiet anchor in the storm of his own emotions, and Kalen felt the first delicate threads of emotional intimacy weaving through him. It was a subtle, intoxicating acknowledgement, the first confession of vulnerability, fragile yet irrevocable, the first step toward connection that neither had fully articulated but both had recognized. The Alpha exhaled slowly, a long, deliberate release of tension. And yet he did not move away. He remained, allowing presence and awareness to speak in place of words. The bond was no longer nascent, it was beginning to take form, delicate and powerful, a force that had been building for cycles and would continue to grow. Kalen understood, with both caution and anticipation, that vulnerability was no weakness, but the foundation of the connection, trust, and intimacy that had begun to define the space between them. By the time the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, painting the edges of the forest in gold and silver, Kalen felt a quiet calm descend, tempered by awareness and anticipation. The first confession, unspoken yet acknowledged, had shifted the balance, deepened the bond, and allowed the Alpha to recognize a truth long denied: connection, trust, and emotional intimacy were possible, even within the confines of duty, hierarchy, and the relentless expectations of leadership. And in that quiet, fragile moment, Kalen understood something profound. The bond with the guard was no longer a simple matter of fascination or admiration. It was a force that demanded recognition, presence, and emotional courage, a force that would continue to grow, deepen, and define the path of their connection in ways neither could yet fully anticipate. The first vulnerability had been offered, the first trust acknowledged, and the Alpha's heart, long shielded, had begun to open in a way that would irrevocably change both him and the guard. The forest was drenched in the soft glow of late afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long, shifting shadows across the glade and the edges of the stronghold. The air was heavy with the scent of moss, damp earth, and the faint fragrance of wildflowers that clung stubbornly to the forest floor. Even the wind seemed to move with deliberate slowness, weaving through the trees in subtle currents that hinted at secrets, quiet whispers, and promises that had yet to be spoken. Kalen moved through this hushed world with the precision of an alpha, boots brushing stone and leaf alike, yet his mind was far from the usual focus of patrols, strategy, or territory management. His thoughts, as they had been for days and nights, returned to the guard. The pull of fascination, admiration, and unspoken connection had only grown stronger since the first acknowledgement of vulnerability in the clearing beneath the moon. Kalen had confronted the stirrings of desire, had admitted to himself the magnetic draw of the guard's presence, and had recognized the subtle emotional thread weaving between them. Yet tonight, unlike previous nights, there was an almost tangible urgency in the pull, a quiet insistence that demanded he move closer, not physically alone, but emotionally, in acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The guard stood at his post near the edge of the forest, a silhouette of disciplined vigilance against the fading light. The alpha's eyes followed every movement, every shift of weight, every flex of muscle, yet it was the subtler details, the tilt of the head, the calm steadiness of breath, the poised tension in shoulders, that captivated Kalen. There was a rhythm to the guard's presence, a quiet resonance that aligned with the alpha's own, creating an invisible thread of connection that neither command nor duty could sever. Kalen felt that thread pull taut in the spaces between them, delicate yet undeniable, subtle yet overwhelming. He approached slowly, each step measured, careful, and deliberate, a reflection of both the authority he bore and the growing desire he could no longer ignore. The guard did not move, nor did he speak, yet Kalen sensed an awareness, a recognition of proximity and presence that transcended words. The forest seemed to bend around them, the fading sunlight catching in the leaves, the shadows stretching and shifting like a private stage upon which their connection played out in silence. Every subtle gesture, the brush of an arm against the other's space, the gentle turn of the head, the small inhale of breath, became a note in a delicate symphony of awareness and emotional tension. Kalen's chest tightened as he drew closer, his mind acutely aware of the dangerous exhilaration building within him. The bond they shared was no longer limited to fascination or admiration. It had grown into something more intricate, something that demanded acknowledgement, trust, quiet understanding, and the first subtle recognition of emotional closeness. The alpha felt the stirrings of anticipation, tempered by restraint, and the ache of longing that had begun to echo persistently through his chest. The guard shifted slightly, a movement so small it might have been unnoticed by anyone else, yet to Kalen it was a signal, a quiet acknowledgement that the unspoken connection was mutual, a subtle confirmation that the emotional proximity they shared was as palpable for the guard as it was for the alpha. The sensation coursing through Kalen was intoxicating, a blend of excitement, caution, and curiosity that sent his heart racing with an intensity he had never before allowed himself to feel. He recognized in that moment that the bond was evolving, no longer merely a quiet fascination or protective admiration, but an active, breathing connection that demanded attention, recognition, and emotional courage. Kalen's gaze lingered on the guard's features, the sharp jaw, the deep-set eyes, the subtle flex of muscles under the fabric of duty and uniform. There was discipline here, yes, but beneath that discipline lay something far more vulnerable, a quiet humanity that Kalen found irresistible. He realized, with an almost startling clarity, that this presence, so steadfast, so poised, so utterly dependable, had become essential, magnetic, a force within his world that could not be ignored or denied. Every heartbeat, every inhalation, every faint movement between them resonated with the possibility of emotional closeness, of trust, and of intimacy that went beyond the boundaries of duty or rank. The forest itself seemed to mirror the tension between them, the gentle sway of branches, the shifting patterns of light and shadow, the distant rustle of wildlife, all accentuating the fragile, potent connection building in the quiet glade. Kalen felt the first delicate awareness of shared rhythm, an alignment of presence that was no longer one-sided. The alpha's chest tightened with a mixture of exhilaration and fear, the thrill of connection tempered by the knowledge of the delicate balance they maintained between desire and discipline. Time stretched, measured not by clocks or sunlight, but by the invisible threads of awareness, presence, and emotional energy that bound them together. Kalen found himself drawn into the guard's orbit, not as a leader commanding obedience, but as a being seeking recognition, understanding, and the quiet intimacy that had begun to take root. Each breath, each subtle shift of posture, each measured glance reinforced the unspoken acknowledgement between them, a fragile yet powerful connection that neither words nor actions could fully capture. Kalen's mind wandered, tracing possibilities, imagining the implications of emotional closeness. He pictured moments of trust, of shared space unburdened by expectation, where silence was comfortable and presence alone conveyed understanding. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him, a mixture of anticipation and caution, a recognition that to step closer emotionally was both a risk and a necessity. He felt the first tangible pull of desire interwoven with trust, the awareness that the bond was no longer simply about admiration or fascination, but about the quiet acceptance of one another's presence, essence, and emotional depth. The guard remained poised, a silent anchor, yet Kalen could sense the subtle acknowledgement of their shared awareness. It was in the way the eyes flickered briefly to meet his, the faint relaxation of shoulders, the minute incline of the head that suggested recognition without words. Each detail magnified the tension and intimacy between them, reinforcing the growing closeness and the delicate threads of trust and understanding that were forming in silence. Kalen felt his chest tighten again, a mixture of awe, anticipation, and the first awareness of vulnerability that came not from weakness but from the courage required to acknowledge connection and emotion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the glade in the soft gold and amber of twilight, Kalen allowed himself a deliberate step closer. The space between them decreased, measured yet charged with the invisible pull that had been growing for days. The alpha's awareness sharpened, attuned to every subtle cue, every micro-expression, every unspoken signal. The guard's presence was steady, calming, yet potent in its ability to evoke anticipation, longing, and the first genuine emotional closeness Kalen had allowed himself to feel in cycles of leadership and duty. The tension between them was not merely physical, it was emotional, a quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding and presence that neither needed to articulate aloud. Kalen felt the first threads of true intimacy weaving through his consciousness, an alignment of thought, awareness, and emotional energy that transcended words. He recognized the bond as a living force, delicate yet unyielding, a connection that demanded patience, recognition, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, leaves swaying gently in the night breeze, the faint call of nocturnal creatures echoing softly. Kalen's gaze softened, lingering on the guard with a quiet intensity, acknowledging the presence that had become essential to him, magnetic in its subtlety, and profoundly stirring in ways he had long resisted. He felt the first awareness that emotional closeness was not a breach of duty, but a bridge to trust, understanding, and the delicate, powerful intimacy that was beginning to define the space between them. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, the perception of time irrelevant in the face of the subtle, growing tension. Kalen allowed himself to exhale slowly, a deliberate, measured release of the internal storm of anticipation, curiosity, and longing. Yet he did not step back, he remained, close in proximity and awareness, acknowledging the guard's presence as equal, essential, and irreplaceable. The bond had shifted once more, deepened, and solidified in the quiet spaces of shared observation and unspoken acknowledgement. By the time darkness fully claimed the forest, Kalen felt a profound calm descend, tempered by anticipation and the quiet thrill of emotional intimacy. The first steps of true closeness had been taken, not through words or physical touch, but through presence, recognition, and the shared acknowledgement of trust, fascination, and the nascent stirrings of desire. The Alpha understood that the bond had evolved, grown, and strengthened, demanding both patience and courage, and opening the path toward connection that would ultimately lead to acknowledgement, understanding, and perhaps a deeper, lasting happiness. And in that quiet, moonlit glade, Kaelin realized with clear, unyielding certainty. The bond they shared was no longer a matter of observation, duty, or admiration. It was a living, breathing connection, delicate yet powerful, invisible yet tangible, and utterly essential. A force that would continue to grow, deepen, and define the path of their relationship in ways neither could fully anticipate, but both had already begun to embrace. Night had fully embraced the Silverfang stronghold, wrapping the towering walls and surrounding forest in a blanket of darkness that softened the edges of reality. The moon, swollen and luminous, poured silver light across the glade where Kaelin and the guard now found themselves, a secluded haven that had grown familiar over the past cycles. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine, earth, and the lingering warmth of the day, and it seemed to vibrate subtly with anticipation, as if the forest itself recognized the unspoken tension between the Alpha and his guard. Kaelin moved through the clearing with deliberate calm, each step precise, measured, and controlled, yet beneath the surface his pulse raced. The days and nights of silent fascination, subtle observation, and unacknowledged emotion had built into a crescendo of tension he could no longer ignore. The bond with the guard had deepened beyond mere admiration or curiosity. It had evolved into something potent, fragile, and undeniably magnetic. Tonight, the Alpha felt that this invisible thread between them demanded acknowledgement, presence, and the courage to confront emotions long restrained. The guard stood a short distance away, motionless yet impossibly alive in the Alpha's awareness. Every detail, the line of the jaw, the slight flare of nostrils, the calm but attentive gaze, was amplified in Kaelin's mind, magnified by the quiet intimacy of shared space and unspoken understanding. The Alpha's chest tightened as he approached, drawn by a force that was as compelling as it was dangerous, a gravitational pull of fascination, trust, and desire. He felt the weight of proximity, the thrill of anticipation, and the first raw stirrings of courage mingling with the vulnerability he had cautiously nurtured over days. Time itself seemed suspended, measured not by the sun or the shadows but by the invisible tension that wove itself between them. Every subtle gesture, every measured shift of stance, every inhalation of breath became a language unto itself, a dialogue of awareness and presence that neither words nor orders could articulate. Kaelin felt the first tangible weight of emotional honesty pressing against his chest, a recognition that the bond they shared was no longer a quiet, unspoken thread, but a living force demanding acknowledgement, trust, and courage. The Alpha's eyes lingered on the guard's features, tracing lines and expressions with deliberate care. There was discipline here, yes, and unwavering control, but beneath it was something more, a quiet humanity, vulnerability masked by duty, and a steady presence that resonated deeply within Kaelin's own being. He felt the pull of proximity intensify, the magnetic force of their bond drawing him closer, yet he did not move impulsively. Every step was measured, a balance of desire and caution, respect and anticipation. The moment felt sacred, suspended in the delicate equilibrium of trust, emotion, and awareness. Kaelin's thoughts drifted, circling the memory of the first acknowledgement of vulnerability beneath the moon, the subtle closeness in the twilight glade, the quiet rhythm of presence and awareness that had defined their shared moments. Tonight, those threads had woven into a tapestry of emotional intensity, rich and intricate, demanding recognition. The Alpha realized, with startling clarity, that the guard's presence had become essential to his equilibrium, magnetic in a way that transcended duty, fascination, or superficial attachment. Every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of attention heightened the tension and anticipation in the clearing. The guard's gaze flicked toward Kalen, brief but intentional, a silent acknowledgement that mirrored the Alpha's own awareness. There was no need for words, the moment itself carried an unspoken promise, a recognition of mutual understanding and emotional alignment. Kalen felt the first real, unmistakable stirrings of desire mingled with trust, admiration, and the fragile tremors of vulnerability that had long been suppressed. The realization struck him fully. This was not fascination alone, nor was it merely emotional closeness. It was the first step toward intimacy, the first acknowledgement of the bond as a force that could not be ignored. The forest seemed to pulse with anticipation, leaves rustling softly in the night breeze, shadows shifting and stretching in response to the tension threading through the clearing. Kalen felt every subtle movement magnified, every small gesture, a shift of weight, the inhale of breath, the tilt of a shoulder, imbued with profound significance. The bond between them was no longer nascent or tentative, it was alive, dynamic, and demanding recognition. And yet, the Alpha remained measured, aware of the balance required between desire, respect, and the fragile trust that had been nurtured in silence. Kalen's heart beat with a steady, insistent rhythm as he stepped closer, closing the space between them by mere inches. The magnetic pull of their bond intensified, the invisible thread taut with anticipation. He felt the warmth radiate from the guard, a subtle but undeniable presence that contrasted with the cool night air, and the awareness of proximity sent shivers of exhilaration and tension through him. The Alpha recognized, with clarity tempered by caution, that the moment was pivotal, a fragile intersection of trust, emotional intimacy, and the first acknowledgement of desire that could no longer be contained in silence. The guard's eyes met Kalen's again, steady and unwavering, yet beneath the control there was a flicker of recognition, a subtle acknowledgement of the shared tension threading through the night. Kalen felt his chest tighten at the sight, a mixture of anticipation, awe, and vulnerability that demanded acknowledgement. The connection between them had grown into a force, delicate yet unyielding, a silent dialogue of presence, awareness, and unspoken trust that neither words nor touch could fully encapsulate. Kalen allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, releasing some of the tension coiled in his chest, yet he remained poised, close in proximity and aware of every nuance. The forest around them seemed to lean in, the gentle sway of branches and the whisper of leaves echoing the quiet, charged anticipation that enveloped the clearing. He felt the first tangible resonance of emotional alignment, the subtle energy that passed between them in absence of touch, words, or command. It was a fragile acknowledgement, yet it carried the weight of intimacy, connection, and the beginnings of desire. Minutes passed with deliberate slowness, measured in breaths and shifts of presence rather than time. Kalen allowed himself to dwell in the proximity, in the awareness of the guard as a living, breathing force of both stability and vulnerability. The Alpha felt the threads of closeness weaving into something more potent, a fabric of shared trust and recognition that demanded the courage to take the next step. Every heartbeat echoed with the anticipation of acknowledgement, of recognition, and of the fragile, intoxicating pull toward intimacy that had long been restrained. The moonlight fell directly upon them, silvering the edges of their forms and highlighting the subtle tension between the two. Kalen's eyes softened as they lingered on the guard, tracing features with deliberate care, noting the calm resilience and the quiet humanity that radiated beneath disciplined exterior. There was trust here, yes, and yet more, there was acknowledgement of presence, awareness of shared emotion, and the unspoken promise of connection. The Alpha recognized, with a sudden, profound clarity, that the bond they shared had moved beyond fascination, beyond admiration, and into the realm of intimate possibility. Kalen felt his pulse race as he allowed himself to close the remaining space with in them, careful, measured, and deliberate. The guard remained poised, yet Kalen sensed the subtle alignment of awareness, the faint tension of shared anticipation, the quiet acknowledgement that the emotional energy between them had reached a threshold. The Alpha's chest tightened with exhilaration, desire, and the first full embrace of vulnerability that he had permitted himself. The bond was no longer theoretical or distant, it was immediate, alive, and irrevocable in its presence. The forest, cloaked in night and silvered by the moon, seemed to hold its breath in the quietude, as if acknowledging the significance of the moment. Kalen felt the first stirrings of emotional release, a tentative step toward intimacy that required no physical contact, no words, but carried the weight of acknowledgement, desire, and trust. The Alpha's mind traced the possibilities, the delicate balance of restraint and surrender, the fragile bridge between duty and personal feeling. He recognized, with awe and anticipation, that this was the first moment that could change everything, if only he allowed the bond to fully exist between them. By the time the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon, painting the edges of the forest in soft pinks and golds, Kalen remained close, chest taut with anticipation and mind focused entirely on the presence of the guard beside him. The first true acknowledgement of emotional intimacy had been established, fragile yet powerful, a shared force of trust, fascination, and desire. The Alpha understood with unyielding certainty. The bond could no longer be ignored, denied, or restrained. It was alive, dynamic, and irrevocably changed the landscape of both their hearts. And in that quiet, silvered glade, Kalen realized something profound. The moment had indeed changed everything. The emotional thread between them had grown into a living force, delicate yet unyielding, magnetic and potent, capable of shaping the course of their connection, their trust, and their hearts. It was a moment of clarity, of alignment, and of the first full acknowledgement that intimacy, emotional, delicate, and powerful, was now possible, imminent, and irresistible. The dawn arrived softly over the Silverfang stronghold, spilling pale golden light across stone walls, forested perimeters, and the wide expanse of the clearing where Kalen often walked in quiet reflection. The air was crisp, scented with dew, pine, and the faint tang of wildflowers that had persevered through the night. The pack moved through the early morning with the familiar rhythm of life, the muted footsteps of wolves, soft rustle of fur, and quiet communication through eyes, posture, and subtle gestures. Yet for Kalen, the world felt different, altered by the weight of realization and the culmina. Tian of moments that had stretched and folded across cycles of tension, vulnerability, and trust. He moved through the courtyard with a quiet purpose, his boots brushing the stone with measured precision, yet his chest carried a subtle warmth, a ripple of emotion that had been growing since the first acknowledgement of vulnerability beneath the moonlight. The bond with his guard had transformed, evolved from fascination to trust, from admiration to intimacy, and now into a full acknowledgement of connection that demanded both presence and acceptance. Kalen felt that connection like a tether, invisible yet powerful, drawing him into a closeness that was no longer tentative or unspoken. The guard was there, as always, standing at attention near the edge of the stronghold, yet his presence today carried something different. A subtle relaxation, a soft ease that suggested mutual understanding and the quiet recognition of a shared bond. Kalen observed him with the same intensity and care that had marked every glance and moment of proximity, yet now there was no hesitation, no distance of denial. The Alpha's chest tightened with anticipation, tempered by the calm certainty that they had crossed the threshold of silent connection into something tangible, enduring, and undeniably theirs. Kalen approached slowly, each step deliberate, measured, yet carrying the magnetic pull that had defined the threads of their bond for so long. The air seemed charged with the weight of recognition, the delicate balance between desire and respect, trust and vulnerability. Every detail was magnified in his perception. The way the guard's posture softened slightly, the tilt of the head, the steady inhale and exhale that mirrored Kalen's own rhythms. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, every leaf, every shadow, every shaft of light accentuating the quiet culmination of shared anticipation and acknowledgement. For Kalen, the journey to this moment had been long and intricate, marked by observation, fascination, internal confession, emotional vulnerability, and shared closeness. Each previous chapter of their relationship, the silent walks through the forest, the subtle acknowledgement of presence, the fragile confessions of trust and vulnerability, had built toward this final, defining space. It was here, in the quiet interplay of presence, awareness, and emotion, that the Alpha allowed himself to fully recognize what he had known, feared, and desired. The guard was no longer simply a companion, protector, or subordinate. He was an essential part of Kalen's world, magnetic, steady, and profoundly necessary. The guard's eyes met Kalen's with steady calm, and yet beneath the discipline there was the flicker of awareness, acknowledgement, and something more, a recognity. On of shared desire, trust, and connection. Kalen felt the tension and exhilaration that had threaded through countless silent moments between them rise to the surface, tempered by the quiet knowledge that what had been built was no longer fragile. The bond had transformed into a living, breathing force, capable of sustaining closeness, emotional intimacy, and the delicate equilibrium of trust and recognition that both had longed for but feared to articulate. The Alpha took a measured step closer, reducing the distance to a span defined by proximity, awareness, and the subtle pull of connection. Every detail of the guard, the calm poise, the steady breathing, the quiet strength, resonated within Kalen, each element a note in the symphony of intimacy and trust that had been composing itself over days and nights. There was no need for words. The forest, the dawn, the soft stirrings of the pack, and the invisible thread between them spoke volumes. Kalen felt the weight of acknowledgement settle in his chest, a delicate blend of exhilaration, relief, and profound joy. The sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling warm light across the clearing and illuminating every subtle shift of posture, every flicker of expression, every tiny detail that had been magnified by countless moments of observation and proximity. Kalen reached the final step, standing close enough to sense the warmth, presence, and quiet energy of the guard. In this proximity, the Alpha felt the culmination of everything that had brought them here. The fascination, the vulnerability, the emotional closeness, the unspoken trust, and the first real acknowledgement of desire. Each element interwove into a tapestry of connection that was both fragile and indestructible. Kalen's chest rose and fell with deliberate care, every breath a meditation on trust and presence, every heartbeat a quiet affirmation of connection. The guard remained poised, yet there was a subtle softening, an unspoken release of tension that mirrored Kalen's own. It was in these small shifts, the relaxation of shoulders, the gentle incline of the head, the steady exhale of breath, that the Alpha recognized the culmination of their journey together. The bond had matured, strengthened, and become unassailable, not in dominance or authority, but in shared acknowledgement, presence, and mutual desire. Time itself seemed irrelevant in the clarity of the moment. Kalen allowed himself to dwell in proximity, in the shared presence, in the delicate interplay of awareness and anticipation. The forest around them, the shifting shadows, the rustle of leaves, and the distant movement of the pack all faded into insignificance compared to the gravity of the moment. He felt the threads of emotional closeness, trust, and desire intertwine into a singular force, one that demanded recognition, acceptance, and celebration of the bond they had forged in silence, vulnerability, and shared experience. With deliberate care, Kalen allowed himself to extend acknowledgement beyond mere observation. The connection between them pulsed in the quiet space, a living force of presence and emotional intimacy. The Alpha recognized, with clarity tempered by awe, that the culmination of tension, vulnerability, and trust required a conscious embrace of the bond, a full acknowledgement of shared hearts, quiet desire, and the subtle joy that had grown unspoken but undeniable. The guard's gaze softened, meeting Kalen's with a quiet intensity that mirrored every thought, every stir of emotion, and every subtle desire that had passed between them. The Alpha felt the final threads of hesitation unwind, replaced by an awareness of mutual recognition and the delicate balance of intimacy that had defined the evolution of their bond. Every element, the proximity, the gaze, the unspoken acknowledgement, was a declaration, a promise, and an affirmation of the culmination of their journey together. Kalen's chest rose and fell with deliberate calm, the warmth of emotional release and recognition settling through his body. The bond had evolved fully, no longer tentative, delicate, or uncertain. It had become a force of trust, presence, and intimacy that could not be broken, diminished, or ignored. The Alpha understood, with profound clarity, that the happiness, fulfillment, and shared contentment he had long feared impossible were now within reach. The first light of full dawn spilled across the clearing, bathing the Alpha and the guard in a warm glow that seemed to bless their shared presence. Kalen felt the culmination of anticipation, vulnerability, and emotional closeness ripple through him in waves, and he allowed himself, for the first time in cycles of leadership, duty, and discipline, to surrender fully to the joy, trust, and fulfillment that had been building between them. The connection was complete, solidified in acknowledgement, proximity, and the delicate, enduring intimacy of hearts aligned. The forest seemed to exhale, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of wildlife, and the warmth of morning light creating a sense of celebration that mirrored the quiet, profound happiness between the two. Kalen and the guard existed in shared awareness, a harmony of presence, trust, and emotional fulfillment that had been nurtured, tested, and ultimately affirmed through cycles of tension, closeness, vulnerability, and acknowledgement. In this moment, Kalen recognized the fullness of his journey, the evolution from fascination to trust, from admiration to vulnerability, and from silent acknowledgement to emotional intimacy. The Alpha felt a quiet joy tempered by awe and profound gratitude, as he acknowledged the guard not merely as protector or companion, but as an irreplaceable presence, a partner in heart and spirit, and a force that had reshaped his understanding of love, connection, and happiness. The forest, the dawn, and the clearing itself seemed to resonate with the quiet triumph of connection, presence, and intimacy achieved. Kalen allowed himself one final, deliberate breath, a release of all tension and hesitation, embracing fully the shared acknowledgement, the bond solidified, and the happiness that now defined the space between them. The Alpha understood, with unerring clarity, that this was the culmination of their journey together, a shared, unspoken promise of trust, love, and enduring connection that would remain unshakable, unbreakable, and profoundly fulfilling. And as the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the stronghold, the forest, and the glade, Kalen and his guard stood together in quiet presence, hearts aligned, trust absolute, and the happiness they had long sought finally within reach. The Alpha felt the first true smile of release, the joy of connection, and the fulfillment of desire and emotional closeness bloom within him. It was the happy ending they had both silently yearned for, achieved not through words, but through presence, trust, vulnerability, and the undeniable power of shared hearts.